We get a challenge, casual challenge from a pretty strong player, 2200 plus here. johanWas. Yeah, in fact, 2300 Blitz seems to be, or maybe that's classical. I'm not sure. So let's get cracking here with some e4, e5 stuff for a change. Usually we're playing Caro-Kann, but this is good to play from time to time. Hotly disputed positions, of course. This is the so-called Italian game. And here white goes for d4. Now, back in the day, they used to play c takes d4 a lot. Nowadays, in this position, they mostly play e5. Because it's considered that these lines, after we take the pawn here and we take here, these positions are considered to be not super ambitious for white, if black knows what he's doing. I'll hope to remember the theory. d5 is the main move here. And now, it's a very strange move, but the point is that if you take this bishop, then d5 is coming in, and then black is up a pawn, and center is well defended, etc. So white throws a spanner in the works with this move. And now I believe that the main idea that black has is to just keep his bishop here. And now if, for example, white snaps up this knight, black should be able to just castle and be okay. So, hello, Jesse HF asks, what is the preferred time control? It's 10+0, because it allows commentary and hopefully sort of instructive commentary. So my opponent's going a little bit into the tank here. It's a bit unusual to go into the tank, given the fact that 97. Now, I remember there was actually a Giri game, I think Giri Nakamura or something, where there's some strange d6 line. Like, for example, I think if rook takes castle, d6 is considered quite okay for black. Quite okay for white in terms of equal. So I think you're supposed to go d6 first. So far, we're just following theory. And h6. And the point is, we're hitting this knight. And white, his main idea here is to go queen e2, and then you take this knight, and then they go rook e1. Creating a lot of pressure against this knight on e7, but black has one important resource here against rook e1, which is to go bishop e6. And the point is, black is up a piece, but he has to give it back, so he tries to give it back in the best way possible, and then he plays f6. And the idea of this position is that, well, black is trying to make all the white pieces look a little bit silly, and I think he succeeds in doing that. This move I'm not so familiar with. To be honest with you, this is kind of where my theory ends, so I hope I hope I don't embarrass myself, because I haven't checked this stuff in quite a while, and you do require some precision. I know that the assessment of this variation is that it's not very good for white, but the element of surprise nowadays, most people don't play this, so you might be able to catch somebody out if you have some, deep analysis. Let's say bishop e3 and some deep analysis that, there are some ways to create problems. I'm hoping that my opponent doesn't have any particular deep investigations into this line, but it's just playing it because it's a fun line. At the club level, it's an effective line because a lot of players aren't going to know this theory. In other words, most players, I would venture, are not going to know that the best line is to take and then drop the bishop back and then drop the knight back and then play this whole sequence with h6 and take the knight and then block. If you know this, you know it, but if you don't know it, you don't know it. And That's not very advanced commentary, but you know what I mean. So here, I mean, I feel like queen b6, f4 makes some sense, but on the other hand, why not queen b6 with a check here with some tempo? I'm covering the b4 square, which could be relevant in some spots, like if I go, for example, d5, he doesn't have rook b4 ideas. I considered to go d5 here immediately, but then I was a little bit bothered by rook b4 because suddenly he is threatening to take this pawn on b7, and at the same time he's threatening to take on g5, which I don't really want to allow. Additionally, the queen b6 check line makes sense from the perspective that these moves are not attractive for white. The reason they're not attractive is because white is down a pawn and his endgames are not going to favor him. So generally speaking, he doesn't want to exchange the queens. But on the other hand, if you go here, it might actually just be really bad. For example, you know, there's already some ideas with knight f5 and knight g3 would be a threat of mate. So, you know, you have to be very careful in these spots. And the other idea is d5. And now that the b4 square is not available, if white has to drop the rook back, then I would take this pawn. Or again, with this position like this, you could go knight f5 and you'd have this double hit. And if you go, let's say, rook f3, then you would have ideas like knight d4. All of this is a bit scary because the knight is a great blockader of this pawn. My opponent goes queen f2. I'm definitely not scared of that move. Now the only question is, do I want to exchange the queens, or do I want to maintain the tension and tell him, you know, if you exchange, you open up this semi-open file. It might be interesting if I want to keep the king here in the center just to aid in this blockade. It might be an interesting way to activate my rook. So the candidate moves I'm considering here is queen takes f2, king takes f2, and then, you know, thinking there are some chances to win this pawn. d5, and then the point is, well, where exactly are you going with your rook? You could go to d4. I think, yeah, I mean, in the end, I'm just going to go queen takes here, and I'm thinking d5 here now. Actually, this was a little bit silly. This was a premature move here, d5, because I realize now he does have this possibility of rook b4, which he already had before, hitting the pawn on b7. So I really shouldn't have allowed that. I should have just captured here. It was very, very silly of me to play very quickly. And then the point is, if he takes, I can actually just snap another pawn, and I think I'm just completely winning. This move d5 is a bit of a brain fart, actually. And now I have to consider, for example, I could go b5, but the problem is he now wants to take this pawn. So really, very, very silly move, allowing some counterplay here. I just relaxed one move too soon, and once he takes here, it's going to be a little bit better for him than sorry, it's not going to be. I think I'm still better, but it's going to be more than I needed to give him in this position. We'll recapture. Definitely some argument for taking on h2, but after pawn takes, I was a little bit concerned, but actually now that I think about it, I probably should have taken this pawn, so I'm not playing fantastically. On the other hand, after the move h3, I might have the move rook h4 here, which is kind of a funky idea, challenging this rook and sort of protecting, you know, asking him, well, what are you going to do about this rook? If you take me, then I'm going to take back, and the structure is going to be a little bit better. And if you try to come at my pawns after that exchange with rook e5 and some rook h5, rook g5 ideas, I'm going to have rook f8 and rook f5 and just sort of kick you away. At the end of the day, I think the position is extremely promising here for black, because this pawn here is, in my view, more of a liability than it is an asset. The structure is very healthy for me. The bishop is a little bit out of play. And my long-term plan is just put my king here, maybe put my rook here, and quarrel this pawn, which I'm claiming is more of a liability than an asset. Somebody is asking, what is the queue? How long is the queue to play me? At the moment, it's not a long queue at all. There's 3 players here. It's Jesse F, Vijay Rag and Trip Chance. Sorry, I should say I'm only playing 10+0 games. So to Vijay Rag and Trip Chance, if you'd like to play me, please challenge 10+0 instead. Maybe in the future we'll do other time controls, but for now that's sort of the policy. Seem to have something. Okay, so he's going bishop c2. I'm trying to see what the idea is behind this move. I don't think there's any deep idea. It's just the bishop here isn't doing much, so he's rerouting it to a better diagonal. It makes sense. I'm going to give this check, and soon I'm going to put the king on d6. I could have started with king c7, but the thing that annoyed me there is he'd go king f3 and then put the king on g4. Maybe that's actually what he should have done here, gone king f3 immediately. But maybe king f3 immediately. Yeah, no, I think king f3 immediately actually gave me some things to worry about. Yeah, this was a very good plan. And I think if he had done that, it would have been quite challenging, because once he puts his king here, if I go defensive with rook here, then he'll go rook f1 and rook f7. So I think that was a missed opportunity with bishop c2. Let's go king to c7. For some reason, I seem to have something bothering me in my eye. Like, oh yeah, it's just a hair. Okay, so king goes to c7. We want the king onto d6. And I think at this point, I think a couple of critical moments in the position. I really think this was such a silly mistake by me. Just an automatic move. It looks good, d5, but the reality is I will have this move whenever I want it. And then in the meantime, you know, I can just grab a pawn here, and he has a problem, right? If he recaptures, then the pawn on h2 I can just grab, and d5 I could just play anytime that I want. And I think that position would have just been winning effectively 2 pawns up. But after this, I gave myself 2 problems and only 1 move, so I had to do something. And now I ended up with this structure. Probably I should have taken here, or maybe some fancy move like rook here. I'm not sure, but probably just scooping up this pawn made a lot of sense. And here, rook h4, maybe not even the best move. Maybe something like rook here first, and then if king g3, then maybe, you know, just defend with rook f5 or something like that, and slowly untangle, maybe even going for some push of this protected passer at some point. Although that's always dangerous to start putting my pawns like this, because I put them on dark squares, and that would make this bishop a lot more effective. But here I think rook h4 was probably silly, because I missed this idea, which is I think quite an annoying idea. I'm not sure exactly how to combat it without going passive and allowing him to generate play along the f-file. But thankfully he played bishop c2, and now I think my position is much better. Okay, he goes g3. It's an interesting try, but do I have the move rook f2 here? Rook f6 rather. The point is, if he takes, I'll take here and I'll take here. That's a pretty good trade for me, because then he'll have these double pawns, which I'm not scared about. The question is, if he takes, if I take, I guess his idea is rook here, but I could just go take rook here and then rook f2. That's really attractive as well, because I hit his bishop, and when he moves his bishop, I start collecting some pawns here. The only problem with that line is that when he eventually takes this pawn, I'm a bit worried that he'll take the g7 pawn, and then he'll create some problems with the h pawn. So I have to calculate something here, like rook here, rook takes. Sorry, not rook takes. This position here, bishop somewhere, like bishop d3 maybe. Bishop d3, rook takes b2, rook takes g3, rook takes a2, rook takes g7, king d6. And then I guess I can actually just put my rook behind the pawn here. And he doesn't have this square, and all of these maneuvers are very slow. So that doesn't seem very good. I guess I can just see if this is a little bit cleaner. Rook f6, I guess he could go rook g1, and I can take this pawn and then take this pawn. But I think I'm quite convinced with this idea. If he goes rook g1, I'm going to go rook f2. And I think that, yeah, I think it's pretty good. For black, I think it should just be winning. So I don't see the other one as more clear. Hello to latecomers into the chat, or not latecomers per se, but people who arrived recently, recent comers. So he does go for that. What else to do if you're white? You may as well do this. I do think if he plays something like this, it's going to be a big blunder, because then I can take the pawn and he won't be able to take this because of the fork. So bishop d3 as expected. Now I can definitely check, do I have something funky like d4, knight f5, stuff like that. I'm not really seeing anything, so I'm going to go with the original plan. And here, one idea that I have actually that I hadn't originally seen is just to play the move g6. And the point is that then I could get into a rook and pawn endgame. Maybe that gives me, maybe that's better. I don't know. Okay, so g6, bishop takes, knight takes, rook here maybe. Or just rook takes. Rook check on g7, king here, rook takes. No, okay, I'm going to go for rook takes. Probably the other one is also winning, but I feel like this should be pretty. I mean, I don't want to give up this b7 pawn, and potentially in some variations I was seeing that the king would end up on the back rank. Don't really have time to show those lines right now. And rook goes here. Yeah. So now maybe a check just to force him back. If he goes forward, I'll have c5 and that'll be crushing. And I could take this pawn. I certainly could take the pawn. But maybe let's just try and push. Okay, h6, a3, rook here, a2. And he'll have to go with the rook, and then I can take this one and take this one, and it'll be 3 clean pawn endgame, like 3 extra pawns. And if he starts going bishop b1, I can still go a3, h6, a2, bishop takes, rook check, and pick up the bishop, and still should have enough time to come back for this guy. So very hard to figure out what to do here as white. I guess you could maybe go bishop here, again a3, rook here, then would be met by knight takes, pawn takes, rook takes. And otherwise, if bishop here, a3, if you don't play rook h8, how are you going to stop the pawn? So my opponent is thinking what to do, but I think none of his active plans, which I see, which is rook here and here, or the push of the pawn, none of them seem to be getting very far. a2 is my threat here. The point being that after bishop takes, I have this skewer. I could also go rook here actually, but given that I have only 50 seconds on the clock and I already had sort of calculated that this position should be winning, there's no need to start calculating something else. You have to be a bit pragmatic. Just pick the line that is most straightforward. Okay, he wants some sort of h7 ideas. I could definitely just go here and nab the pawn, but I think I'll just go rook a8 and cover the square. Rook g7 is met by knight f5. Here I'll take the pawn. Although I maybe could have started to push the pawn here. For rook g7, I'll just take it and king f7. Or just take it and ignore because the knight is covering the square. So he does resign. Yeah, at this stage the rook is actually trapped, in the sense it doesn't have any squares here. So without being able to move the rook, you're never going to be able to make progress. So thank you, Johan. It was an interesting game.